have Gary Paluso with us this morning, as we talked about, and he's going to be leading us in a discussion about politics and church. So we've talked about this before. Should we talk about it? Should we not talk about it? And whatever. So Gary would be a good one to lead us through this. I thought I'd start with saying this. If you're a football fan, you know today's a couple of big games in the NFL. And last week there was what was called the game of the century. And it was the Buffalo Bills and the Kansas City Chiefs. We got some Chief fans here. And they ended up tied with, or actually Kansas City was behind with 13 seconds. And if you're a football fan, you know the magic of Patrick Mahomes. And in 13 seconds, he took the Chiefs down the field and tied the game. It ended up then in overtime that they ended up winning the game. It was pretty exciting if you're a football fan to watch. Amazing talent. Well, this last week, the Kansas City fans, one of the fans sent out a tweet and said, in honor of both the Chiefs and the Bills, send $13 donation for the 13 seconds that it took to tie the game, and send $13 to the Children's Hospital in Buffalo. And this is the charity, foundation charity, that the quarterback for the Bills, the losing team, has. So that was their way of honoring, being good fans, etc. So I'm going to ask you to be a good fan today when Gary is presenting his lessons and asking us questions. And let's all maybe just donate our 13 seconds to Goodwill today. So with that, we'll have Gary Peluso. Thank you, Gary, very much. Oh, let's start, I'm so sorry. Let's start with a word of prayer. Bill?
Sure. Father, before we pray, how about a round of appreciation for Kathy for the last couple of years? Father, we thank you for this day and the opportunity to be together in fellowship, to learn. We ask that you be with those in our class and lead your healing hand. We ask you to continue to bless our class and our church. These things we pray in Jesus' name.
Good morning. So I had emailed Kathy about a project I wanted to do, and she emailed back and said, well, I got a better idea than the one that I had proposed, and let me know that the person who was going to be here this Sunday couldn't be here, and that I want to come, and rather than asking her to circulate a question via you all by email, you want to come and ask them yourself. And so that's why I'm here, and that's why I have this topic in front of me. Over the last about 5 years or so, a little more than that now, I've written upwards of 200 blogs for the seminary, nearly every week, other than the year I was on sabbatical. So I guess it was actually more like 6 years. Some of those blogs were regarding theological education, especially during the time I was seminary president. But a lot of the blogs have been about something related to religion in public life, or as I love to repeat what my doctoral professor, Mark Marty, used to say, how people commit faith in public. You know, it's an interesting time to be doing that kind of work here in the U.S. of A. I figure I have written somewhere in the vicinity of 200,000 words over that time on the subject. My blogs are 750 to 1,000 words normally. So I was starting to wonder, well, did I actually put enough down that would be coherent to become a book? So I am in the process of trying to organize my thoughts into a book. And what I thought would be most useful would be a handbook for congregations. If you want to talk about politics in church, how do you do that? What would be some conversation starters? What would be the preparatory work you'd have to do? So that's why I'm here this morning. And what I've done is I've taken some 30-something questions that as I went through my blogs, I generated, it's almost like, Johnny Carson used to do, where he'd give the answer and then, and then you'd have to figure out what the question was. So I'm looking back through my blogs, what question was it I was trying to address with this particular blog? So what I'd like to do is really just have a conversation with you this morning. It can go where it will. That'll be helpful to me. I'm going to show you some of my questions, and I've grouped them by categories. And I would simply like to have you talk back to me and say, well, here's what I like about what I'm seeing. Here's an additional question I have. I'm wondering if you would, if this is something you might want to address. Here's a concern I would have about doing this, or a fear I would have about doing this. There are lots and lots of congregations who, when they hear politics in church, the vampire sign goes up. I'm not talking about what our former president talked about, which was to repeal the Johnson Amendment, which is what kind of sets the parameters for what you can and can't talk about from do, not so much talk about, but do as a nonprofit. The IRS 501c3 says that you're a 501c3, you're a charitable organization, and you can't use more than a sliver of time, of your time and resources in anything that would even smack, smell, taste, touch partisan politics. So I am not talking about, former President Trump wanted to eliminate the Johnson Amendment, which would allow churches to openly politic from the pulpit in church. I think eventually it would mean, you put a donation in the offering plate, your church can direct some of that to the candidate of God's choice. And it would really weaponize the church, which in a highly partisan arrangement that we have today, with 80-some% of persons who self-identify as evangelical, having voted for him a couple of times and wants something like him to be president again. So for him, he's thinking this is a base. This is a base of money, this is a base of support. This also is a base where we can increase the conflict, and for some people, conflict is a really good thing. Conflict helps set up enough chaos that you can do lots of things you can't do when things are more settled and ordered. I'm not talking about churches talking, kind of doing endorsements of candidates. I'm talking about more politics as it relates to, frankly, public morality. Now, it may seem counterintuitive or really strange to hear that politics is a moral enterprise. But politics is a moral enterprise. Fundamentally a moral enterprise. The essence of morality is, what do we owe to each other? And we work that out politically all the time. I'm pretty certain that I'm going to have an editorial coming out in the Tulsa World fairly soon on the question of how moral is Oklahoma's budget. Every budget, including your church budget, is a moral document. It's a set of choices about we're going to fund this and not that. We're doing this, we're doing that. We expect these outcomes rather than these outcomes. It could be other than what it is. It's also a statement fundamentally, any budget's a statement fundamentally, your family budget is a statement fundamentally, what do we owe to each other? So when I'm talking politics, I'm talking about those kinds of decisions about what we as a society say we owe to each other. I do think there's at least a little bit in Christianity that relates to questions about what do we owe to each other. I'll also say, just as in preparation, that I'll move on to this. And by the way, what's the ending time?
10 o'clock.
10 o'clock up, straight up, okay. So, you know, I grew up I was born in 55, I grew up in the 1960s. I was just, you know, starting to pay attention to things in the news during, 1968 in the spring with Martin Luther King assassinated, and Bobby Kennedy assassinated, and my brother hadn't yet received his, $300 or whatever it was on the draft, my older brother, so that he didn't have to go to Vietnam. We had neighbors, kids were going to Vietnam and the like. But I grew up at a time when the overlap or the interweaving between home, church, school, culture was pretty tight. We sang, of course, Christmas songs in school. We had Christmas vacation. I'm not sure if we had a Jewish student or a non-Christian student in school. I mean, most of us were aware, are you Catholic or Protestant? And for the Catholic kids, why didn't they go to St. Louis across the street? And all, where the nuns told the kids, you shouldn't be interacting with those Protestant kids after school. That was the divisions of the day, where the 4th of July parade was pretty well, a celebration of all things American. We had a big 4th of July parade in suburban Brookfield, suburban Chicago. And it wasn't, I was a church kid. We said the pledge in school every day. It was pretty seamless. And I'd say it remained that way for me somewhat through high school. High school you begin some questioning, and of course, as the late 60s, early 70s, the Vietnam War is escalating before it de-escalates, and right as I'm going off to college, we have a president he's going to be impeached and all. But frankly, it wasn't until I took my first Bible courses in college where I came to understand that being Christian and being an American are not exactly the same thing. And I would say it was, in fact, one of the first courses I took was on the prophets of the Old Testament. Where the first thing the professor had to say is, prophecy is not what Billy Graham does. Prophets do not predict the future. Prophets are not foretellers, they are forthtellers. They are the ones who say, Israel, this is where we came from. This is the God that we serve. Here are the ways we've now turned away, and the turning away is almost inevitably, especially in the classical prophets of Micah, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Amos, and the like. The turning away is almost always somebody is oppressing the poor. Somebody has rigged the scales for the sake of the rich and against the poor. And you can't read those prophets without seeing that. That was fundamentally there. And that there's all this political stuff going on that had moral weight to it. That was sort of eye-opening for me. And I would say, as my dad really hoped that at some point I would grow out of this what he considered to be radicalism, and re-embrace Americanism as he is a World War II vet. saw it, which for him would have also included making sure you never bought anything Japanese. So I disappointed him on that one because I haven't. Biblical worldview it's different from our basic American worldview in some fundamental ways, and it's the difference. It's kind of interesting when as you think about this. So the difference can often be seen in what we think we mean when we say, "Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven." Because there are some people for whom that means Jesus is coming again. There'll be a big apocalyptic battle. And the kingdoms of this world will be replaced by the kingdom of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. And that's a very active version of Christianity in our nation. Not only in our nation, but we're one of the major exporters of that view of Christianity. There's another view of Christianity which would say, well, what this says is that there is an empire here now, and God's empire is different from that one. And I'm using the word empire, in our Bibles we've said kingdom forever and ever, but kings were from a particular time in European history that we don't have, and that they didn't have in Jesus' day. It wasn't about king, it was about the emperor. When in the Greek, and I know Brandon Scott has been in this class a bunch of times, and Warren Carter now, and Warren, I know Warren's work well enough to know that if Warren was in here, he said, you can't understand Matthew without understanding he was writing under the watchful eye of the empire. That the Basileia tou Theou, the kingdom of God as translated, is actually empire of God. And so this is to say that the ways of the emperor are different from the ways of our God. Now, how are you going to negotiate those two? In an imperial world, you don't have much choice because you don't have the power as to how you work. In a democracy of some sort, we got a lot more choices. And a lot of those choices are, in fact, again, moral choices. And again, our faith has something to say about that. So that's all set up for why this kind of stuff I think is important. What I would, again, find most helpful from you all would be what other questions do you have? What questions intrigue you? What questions concern you? What questions would you think, as you think, could we talk about that as a class? And you'd go, we're not ready for that. So that's what really would be most useful for me. And I've divided the questions thus far into 3 parts, and then there's a 4th that I'll just conclude with. Basically around how do we what would we need to work on in order to just talk to each other in a culture where conversation is so difficult, where polarization is in a negative feedback loop, or an increasing feedback loop, because of the way, in part because of the way we talk to each other, the way we frame things. So, what would we need to do in terms of understanding what genuine civil discourse means? Secondly, what are some of the basic terms that we're using when I'm talking about politics? What are we saying when we're talking about church? What do I actually mean? when we talk about the relationship between religion and politics, and I do talk about that as an absolutely essential relationship, what are we talking about? You may remember, I think last time I was here, when I said, well, religion and politics share this overlap in culture of the stories we tell about where we came from, where we're headed, what we're supposed to be about, what it means to belong, which also includes, of course, what it means to not belong, who doesn't belong, what the basic moral order is, what we owe to each other, and how we express that, and how we become the people that we claim we really want to be. Politics talks about that all the time. Any convention speech, and if Joe Bessler's been in here, which I know he's been many times, he's talked to you about convention speeches that do all that work. Yeah, so does nearly every sermon do that kind of work. So this is an overlap area. That's kind of my starting point. So I've got the basic definitions, and then the way that this plays out in American life through some questions, and then I'm going to create more of some of the resources I've previously done that could be used sort of to stir our imagination. So let me just go through. I'm going to show you the slides first, and then I'll come back to them, okay? So you can kind of see where it is we're headed. So questions like, what does civil discourse mean and entail? How might we speak to one another in a way that breaks free from political polarization? People are absolutely firm in their opinions. Is there any point to trying them even have a conversation? How does one speak truth and truth to power without dehumanizing the other? And are there limits to politics and discussion topic? Which, yes. Or what if the pastor preaches from a point of view you disagree with? These are ones that either I've already addressed, or that in some other settings people have said to me, this is a question I'd love to see addressed. Okay? And I'm going to go quickly through these, and then we'll come back. Basic definitions. Why should we talk about politics in church? What are religion? How are they related? Difference between religion and politics, church and state. If you don't get that difference, I think it makes even wanting to have conversation really difficult. What are the limitations, but also what can you talk about in nonprofits in regard to religion and politics? What do we mean by religion? What do we mean by democracy? I'm going to stop there for just a second. One of the interesting things I think you can see in the news on a daily basis today is when you see someone using the word democracy, see if you can figure out what they're talking about. Because now there are terms coming up in the news that you didn't used to see very often, like liberal democracy and illiberal democracy, which are really important distinctions between them. Or an occasional legislator, somebody from one of the southern coastal states saying recently, you can have too much democracy. So what's being said? There's a lot going on there. What do we mean by democracy? What do we mean by culture, where both democracy and religion live? One of my questions of interest is simply, what are the assumptions about human nature embedded in these systems? I was taught that James Madison, was a student at Princeton, studied under Jonathan Witherspoon, which was a very Calvinistic understanding of human beings, and this check and balance stuff in the Constitution, and concern about if anybody gets too much power, what will they do with it? This is a very Calvinistic understanding of human beings, and maybe not wrong. Maybe this was kind of my throwaway as in I'm just simply interested in because I've heard this so many times now as I've taught on this topic. America's a republic, not a democracy. How do you respond to that? So just as a bit of citizenship work in the midst of all of this too. Then there's the kind of category of religious interpretations of the nation. You know, what is the United States of America? How do we understand it from a religious point of view? We talk about civil religion. I've raised the question, can a nation really trust in God? What are the similarities and differences between the way freedom's used in public life as compared to the way it's used in Christian traditions? And one of the most interesting things about this, for instance, is, do you know, in both classical thought, as in Greece and Rome, as well as in much of early Christianity, to be free meant to be in control of one's appetites. It meant from being free from being pestered by inner demons. It meant free from desires that took one down the wrong paths. That is not the way freedom is talked about in our culture. What an interesting conversation that would be. As well as now practically, how's that play out? How do you respond to those who claim the U.S. is a Christian nation? What about those who claim there's a war on Christmas? How has Christianity contributed? This is kind of a big question that we might have to take 2 or 3 stabs at to get pieces of it out. For better, for worse, what have we contributed? What's the relationship between Christianity and violence? A lot of younger people, especially since 9/11, have associated violence not just with a particular religion, but that religion is the cause of violence, which is partly true, just not fully true. What should Christians know and do about racism in the U.S. and examples of legitimate and illegitimate uses of the Bible in public life? It's easier to find the illegitimate ones, but from a point of view. Anyways, so those are religious interpretations. How we take our faith and apply it to the life of the nation to interpret that. There's also we're citizens and we're disciples. That's what the Lord's Prayer, as far as I'm concerned, sets up for us is we're citizens of more than one realm. And how do we work within that intersection of realms? What can you derive from the Bible either for or against democracy? There's a lot in the Bible that's not very democratic. A lot. And there's also some that lends itself towards the kind of fundamental understanding of human beings that is a part of democracy, or can be a part of democracy. The mainline church in particular, why do we call ourselves the mainline church? Well, because we kind of were from maybe the 19-teens to the 1960s, we represented what Christianity meant to a lot of America. We no longer do. Now, evangelicals would like to say we represent that, but evangelicals have actually dropped in their overall percentage of the population. They're louder. They've got a lot of media on their side, but they've actually dropped as far as percentage of population. So there isn't a main line anymore, one could say, and all of us are having to live. This is Walter Brueggemann, for anybody who has heard his name before. He says we need to learn how to live in exile or in wilderness rather than at the center of the culture. How do we witness from more of a margin? What is responsibility as a congregation have for forming citizens? It's actually been a really important part of what we've contributed to American life. What should we be contributing to the American experiment of e pluribus unum? And what is fair to ask candidates of elected office to disclose about their religious commitments? These are questions I think are real important. So, basically, definitions and relationships so that we can prepare for conversation, religious interpretations of the nation, and citizenship and discipleship. Those are the kind of 3 categories I've broken these into. Let me just go back to the first one there. And I'm going to give about 5 minutes or so to each of these. It's for you to popcorn out, kick back. What catches your attention in one way or the other? Yes?
Number 3, I would not limit to political matters. People who are firm in their religious approach are going to approach this conversation in very different ways as well. I wouldn't limit it to political.
Right. If somebody's absolutely firm in their convictions, what's possible in terms of a conversation? Right. It's a really important one. Yeah, especially, and you'll see, nearly every news source has now almost a regular offering before Thanksgiving, Christmas, holidays, because you can run into family members who, for whom this may apply. It does in mine. Somebody else?
Well, maybe that centers around this is going to be a conversation, not a conversion.
Yes. Right. One of my favorite lines was from someone I did the civil discourse topic presentation for, and the person from the audience said, well, I want to know how to help them listen to what I'm trying to say. Right? And of course the response is, well, the first thing you have to do is listen to what they're trying to say. Yeah, sometimes it's understanding, or one of my favorite lines, how do we achieve this agreement?
And what is the purpose?
And what's the purpose then? Right.
Do you want to understand, or do you want to convince them of a different
Right.
point?
That's right. Which also goes to fundamentally what's our relationship with this person? And is the relationship dependent upon agreement, or is a relationship something that supersedes agreement? Which is especially for a denomination centered in the communion table, this is a continually big question.
I think I recall what everyone used to say from the time of 20 years old to right now. I don't have a dinner party to discuss either religion or politics. And I'm looking at the room, and we have lots of dinner parties, and there's some topic we don't talk about, just because
Sure.
it brings up anger, and the discourse is not friendly, and so forth.
Sure, and probably I would guess even more so today than was the case 20 years ago. Right? Whether we're still conservative Democrats, liberal Democrats, liberal Republicans, conservative Republicans, you had a lot more opportunity for breadth of conversation than this. Yeah.
Our younger daughter works for a libertarian think tank.
Okay.
And they go out of their way. She has a unit called Civil Square. They go out of their way to get educators, business people, scientists, people from all over together at dinner. They have dinner tables. And they bring up questions and start them talking. And some of them, they purposely pick people, obviously, that are going to be on different sides. Some of them have been so successful that the people get together afterwards to discuss and come to some conclusion. But I think it's probably easier when you're taking them to a nice hotel and giving them a really nice.
It is, and I'm going to move on to the next set. But there is an organization that I'm involved with that Barbara Prose, the associate pastor at All Souls, also is, as well as Chris Benj, who used to be Speaker of the House here in Oklahoma, called Braver Angels, which is about depolarizing conversation. And we're going to, in end of April, I think we've got scheduled a first for Oklahoma Red-Blue workshop, where they intentionally recruit 8 people who identify as red, 8 people who identify as blue, and then have structured conversations amongst each other for a couple of Sunday afternoons. And it's a really powerful experience. One of the things that most encouraging to me is that at first, when Bravery Angels started after the 2016 election, they wouldn't do these workshops with politicians. Because you can't get politicians very often to get off their talking points. And to really get in any public sort of forum to a point of honesty. That's changed some. They've actually even done a workshop with some members of Congress recently, which went super well. So there's certainly in the culture, there is this element saying we're discussed it enough with, this doesn't have to be this way. Our moral order is such that we ought to be able to, and they're trying to work on it. Yeah.
We talk a lot about religion and politics. Is there a space to talk about citizenship? Do we talk about citizenship as much as we talk about our philosophy? What do we do on the ground, civics, those kinds of things? Is there a space for that?
Right. That's an excellent point, and really relates to. Let's just take that one. Where do we learn about citizenship? Where do we talk about citizenship? And again, for a lot of you in the room, I'm sure you had multiple points when you're growing up, which probably included scouts, as well as in some ways even in sports teams, or in when you went through youth group and you were first taught some processes of deliberation as you're trying to decide, where you're going to go on a mission trip, how you're going to spend a budget, other sorts of things. These are all thought to be preparations for citizenship also. But how much is citizenship taught in schools? I mean, there's a big thing. And if with a high percentage of the population in our country, in our part of the country, in private schools, where does this happen? Where does this happen? All right, thank you. Basic definitions and relationships. What in this list, again, catches your attention, gives you pause, raises concern, maybe something that should be on here that isn't? Yes?
I don't know exactly how one discusses the problems of contemporary America without dealing with the question of race in a very strong and overt manner.
Right. I agree.
Does it tie into the question of race?
Yes, and in fact, as I have it on this one here, on the next one over, but in the basic definitions, on this one, I'm more trying to get at, when we're talking about religion, what are we talking about? When we're talking about politics, what are we talking about? And then relationship between the two. And again, democracy, what's the difference between a democracy and a republic? I mean, just that, as you know, to have a decent conversation, what do you need to do? You need to have at least some common framework for what the terms are. But I also agree, and very much so, that anything about race, if any conversation about America that doesn't in some way involve race, it's not the whole conversation, but it's in all of the conversation. It's who we've been, are.
And you recall, in the 60s, I remember Baptist churches in Dallas where I grew up, any discussion of civil rights was political, and we don't talk about political things in church. And I think a lot of people that grew up during that time said, well, churches aren't really, they don't have a purpose. They don't get involved.
Right.
It's such an obvious wrong, and
Right.
stand up for it, and they're pretty worthless. And I think that's why a lot of folks left church.
Yes, and actually that division, as you're talking about, between politics and the pulpit thing, that goes back to the era prior to the Civil War, where the defenders of slavery said, this is an economic matter, not a moral matter. It does not belong in conversation in church, whereas those on the abolitionist side said, it sure does. And after the war, just to be real quick, after the war, I always like to say, for my own United Methodist tradition, why did it take from 1844, when we split over slavery, till 1939 for the North and South to get back together. Well, one of the reasons comes from what happened right after the war, when the Southern Methodist bishops regrouped in Palmyra, Missouri, and put out what's called the Palmyra Manifesto, where they accused the North of the political prostitution of the pulpit. That was their phrase. By talking about slavery from the pulpit. So that sort of division between we can talk about these issues, we can't talk about these issues, really goes back to that era. Yeah.
But just further to Mike's point, a showstopper was always that Jesus said, "Bend over Caesar."
Right. Yeah, except that Caesar actually owns nothing and God owned everything, which was the point of that he got them to. It was actually disabusing Caesar of any notion of having any power, property, or anything else, ultimately. Yeah.
Where does self-esteem come in, both from the religious point of view and political, for what we do for others? And I think the second from the bottom kind of speaks to that. That is a difficult thing that we don't seem to want to address. Give it to them, shut them up, put them on their way, they need this. Nothing about their self-esteem.
Right. Sometimes talked about as dignity. Right. And in fact, I have argued that I think one of the primary fundaments for democracy within our faith orientation is every human being has dignity. We're created in the image of God. Also, as along with every right-thinking conservative in the country, these are, the dignity is God-given. If it's God-given, it's something that government can't either give or take away, right? And so that's the sort of thing that I think opens up that larger, deeper conversations about how our faith really does play into how we treat each other. Yeah. Yes.
I like your phrase, culture as soil. It seems that in terms of trying to talk to folks that have a very different opinion, a lot of it is where do they get their information, what sources, and my husband and I are very well aware that there are certain cable news we don't watch because we don't consider them to be worthy of watching.
Mm-hmm.
So, but that's on us as well. The culture is soil that it just so much has grown out of misinformation or information in all the various sources, and all the social media just seems very hard to break into those differences. Anyway, but culture is soil. That's a very powerful image and definition.
Yeah, it is, right. It is for me too, because we all know, unless you have good live soil, everything on this planet dies. Right? And if you're not getting the crops you want, you ought to be looking at what you put in the soil, whether or not it can support that. All right. Religious interpretations of the nation. Civil religion, trust in God, claims that this is a Christian nation, what have we contributed for better and for worse, Christians and race. What are some of the, again, concerns, issues, interests that you would have just by this kind of list?
People pick and choose verses in the Bible and use them not the way they were intended, but also because they're out of context with the time.
Yes, absolutely. So is there a therefore regarding any of these questions in that? So like is that you referring to legit and illegitimate uses of the Bible? Yeah. Yeah. One of the interesting things for me as a as a seminary denizen for a long time, when can you imagine having a genuine debate about the Bible in public life? Right? I mean, you have a couple of different legislators debating Scripture. You don't want to see that, I don't think. In part because they've now gone to a platform for their language which the whole culture doesn't share. I mean, one of the huge differences, right, in our culture, but in Lincoln's day, Lincoln could take so much of his speeches and weave Scripture into it in subtle and overt ways, and a whole lot of the culture knew what he was talking about. They caught it because they were themselves steeped in that language. Not so much anymore. I mean, when you have a lot of school kids who don't know who Moses was, or what a burning bush means, or really what baptism is, you're in a different place. You're in a different place, different context. Yeah, Ron.
Is there a possible risk that nationality could become a hidden idolatry?
Is there a possible risk?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm assuming that's a rhetorical question. Yeah, of course. Every European American scholar from in World War I and World War II era raised those, rang those alarm bells. And a few of it, more than a few have rung them again since last January 6th. Right, where we saw lots of symbolism from Christianity, lots of practices, prayer circles before going and invading the Capitol. I mean, there was a lot of Christianity on display on January 6th. It's actually, what is it called? Uncivilreligion.org, I think it is, where some journalists have collected images and speech clips and other things that from all over the place. I mean, that people at the rally, mob, riot, insurrection, I mean, it was all those things, right? What they themselves were saying out on Twitter that have since been taken down and all that kind of stuff. It's really, if you want to be disturbed, I mean, just, got a Sunday afternoon, nothing else to do, you want to be disturbed, great place to go. Yeah.
You referred to Buz's question about racism to this slide, I think you mentioned the last question.
Yes.
So this address that.
Yes. What would you like to say?
That was the question.
Right.
I guess I'm asking your question.
Yeah, I've got, fundamentally I would say, I don't know if I 100% agree, because I haven't read the 1619 Project, for those of you who've been following this as regards to critical race theory, which is clearly a stand-in for something else in our culture. But race, as in race difference or racism, has been a part of our culture since our colonial founding. Land theft has been a part of our culture since colonial founding. And I mean, we know these stories in Oklahoma. We should know these stories about as well as anybody, right? As a place, like I like to say, Oklahoma is this place where Native peoples were promised a lot regarding Oklahoma. Black people in the post-Civil War era were promised a lot in terms of Oklahoma. I mean, the black towns in Oklahoma is a really interesting, almost unique historical thing. And then, in the land runs, white people were promised. White people coming from all over the world, just about, were promised something. And here these conflicting promises, all broken in some way, we continue to play out. And what's also real clear is that race is a human construction. It's a cultural construction that has been elevated to the point of policy and law and history and the like. And we have done some steps in reckoning with the conflict between freedom and equality when it comes to race, but we are not there. We are not there. And as Christians, again, with the fundamental belief that God created us all in the image of God created us, each of us in the image of God, that there is no Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female in Jesus Christ. We've got the theology to overturn this, but I can. There's a whole lot more I could go through in 3 minutes, but there's obviously there is a lot of Christian history which has been on the other side of this, which has, to use the scholarly term, reified race, raised it to an essential category rather than a cultural construct, and have divided whole societies based on it. I mean, South Africa and the U.S. have done about as thorough a job as anybody is trying to create, two separate and distinct societies, and it's, it is true that Adolf Hitler, when he was figuring out what he was going to do with his hatred towards the Jews, studied both Jim Crow law and the reservation system for Native peoples. He learned from us, and that was a lot. A lot of that was fed by Christians.
Last question for me.
Yep.
War on Christmas. It seems to me that the word war has been used on everything. War against poverty.
Right. Yeah.
And politicians running for office are always going to fight for you. I'm going to fight for you. And I guess there's certain words that jump out at me as automatically, where can you go from there? The war is over. There's not people coming in and attacking Christmas and soldiers and armies.
Right. Yeah, once you've elevated to war, what comes afterwards, right? It's, I talked to somebody this week after the, I joined up one of the Facebook groups for the new Webb telescope, because I'm so interested to see, what we're gonna see 13.7 billion years back into the universe. It's just, for me, it's a fabulous thing. And there were these, some people were putting up pictures of, not from the Webb telescope, but from flyby satellites in both Jupiter and Pluto, which were absolutely stunningly fabulous pictures, right? The kind that you look at and say, that's awesome, right? So if I have declared my dish of macaroni and cheese in front of me as awesome, what is that? Right? I mean, once that's part of the framing of things, right? It's the words create the reality, and I think there's a whole lot more in Christianity we need to keep mining in regard to what words are we using to talk about this, and are these the appropriate words? Are these words going to get us somewhere or not? I'm going to leave this up as we close. I know it's 10 o'clock. So I think it's fun to reimagine historical documents more or less for today. And this is my reimagination of the Gettysburg Address. Nowhere nearly as elegant, of course, as the way that Lincoln wrote it, but where I tried to update a thing or two, but think about saying something like this on a 4th of July weekend, where it's both, you're trying to both say, this is where we've been, but there's still hope for where we can go. If you don't know this about the Gettysburg Address, it is steeped in baptismal imagery of dying and rising, I tried to keep that in this. So I think this kind of reimagination would also be part of this handbook I'd like to put together, because I'm not one who's given up by any stretch of the imagination on the American promise, but defining what that American promise is and for whom that promise is, as well as how we can have a country in which that freedom and equality in some meaningful way are actually yoked, rather than this way, which is, we've been freedom and equality has been very much the secondary one. How do we do that? How do we do that? So I appreciate very much. Thank you for working with me this morning.